car channel.
Today I'm going to show you how to get this greasy, grimy mess all cleaned up. All these carbon deposits over years and years. And I'm going to show you how to turn these super sweet, cleaned up heads. These are off of a Chevy 305. And I've taken the time to completely disassemble them and clean them up. To start this video off, I just want to say I'm not sponsored by any of these tools that are being featured in this video today. So these are the things that you're going to need today. You're going to need a nice drill with a set of these wire spinners, and these are all brass so they won't scratch up the cast aluminum. This will get the majority of the grit off of them, so you've got different shapes here. And then you've got a decent set of sockets. You don't need anything really too fancy. You're only removing probably a couple of bolts. You also will need the socket to remove the old spark plugs if they're not already out. Another thing that is really helpful is these pick tools. They're really nice. They come in a bunch of different shapes, so you can get a lot of that carbon out of there that's scraped in there. Good hammer, flathead screwdriver. Also, if you want to go a little bit more into depth on cleaning it, you can get a Dremel tool, and you can get in there and kind of do a little bit of porting. You can do with a basic Dremel. And then you've got your mineral spirits to clean it all up, and then when you're finally done, you have your paint. The first thing I want to share with you guys is proper etiquette of the head. Now this is off a Chevy 305, and whenever you are transporting heads or anything like that, it's always a good idea to keep them on wood. The other thing is, you don't ever really want to set it on this end where the combustion chamber is down like this, because this is your main mating surface. And if this gets scored in any way, then you're going to have it decked. There's no other way around it. If it gets gashed deep enough, a rock or anything like that gashes into this surface, it's done. And you have to have it planed down far enough so that way you can have a proper mating surface. So the proper areas of storage are on this side here, where you have your exhaust housing and where your spark plugs go in. Obviously, if you're storing this, you don't have spark plugs in it, you can just plug it with some paper or something like that. And if you do have spark plugs in it, they're probably ones that you're not going to use when you install it on the engine. And then you want to go around and just kind of inspect before you do anything. You just want to kind of look at it and see what you're going to be dealing with. So there's a bolt right here that I'm going to have to remove. And you've got some spark plugs, so I'm going to have to get my spark plug socket and pull those out. What I meant by spark plug socket is I've got this here, and what it's got is it's got a, I don't know if that'll focus, it has a rubber grommet in there, so that way it doesn't crack the porcelain when it goes on to the spark plug. So you put it on there, slightly kind of rotate it a little until it gets onto the threads. And once it's all the way down, throw your ratchet on there, give it some force, and it'll come right out just like that. And then just do that for the rest of them. As I said before, there's one more bolt here, but it was just finger tight, so I'm able to just unscrew it like this. Next thing you need to do is remove these rockers. Now these end up being a 5/8, so I'm just gonna do the same thing as you did for everything else. Put a little muscle into it and remove the rockers all the way. Now if you get a little impatient like we all do, you can always take your impact and just remove them quickly. Just remove the rockers and nuts. Put them off to the side. Now these rockers have a little swivel washer on them, so one side is rounded, and so that's so when the nut sits on it and the rod comes up, then it can open up that valve and it can swivel on there instead of creating tight pressure that won't allow it to move. It can kind of move around, and this is oiled. Oiled comes up the rod and through a little hole right here. So we're just gonna set all this stuff aside. Next part of this is removing these valves and the valve springs and retainers. First thing I always do is I take this giant socket and I set it right on top of there. It's about the same size, and I grab it and I take a nice hammer and I just swat each one of these. And what that does is that breaks up the bond between the retainers and the spring cover, between that and the valve. And so that way it's free. So that way when you try and put pressure on that spring to relieve those keepers, the valve stem does not go with it. It actually splits apart, and you're able to break those because you've already broken that connection that they've been sitting in. I know that I didn't mention it in the beginning of this video, but the most important tool that you can ever use is your safety glasses. You always want to have these on anytime you're doing any kind of work, because if you're smacking one of those and those keepers fly up into your eye or something like that, you could lose your vision forever. So always make sure you always use the proper safety equipment that you need, or don't do the job at all. So the next tool that you're going to need is a valve spring remover or compressor, or there's a bunch of different types of tools. This is one of the tools, and the idea behind it is that you've got these two jaws and you clamp down onto the spring. It holds the spring. This goes on top of the plate and you screw that down, and then the idea is that you are to be able to reach in there with a magnet and pull out your keepers. The other ones they have are almost like a giant vise that slowly pushes in on both sides, but one side is open like that, so it pushes it through and you can grab the keepers out of there. I got sick and tired of using those, so I invented my own little thing, and I think that there is somebody that sells these, but I just took a piece of flat bar and I cut out a little notched V right here, drew a bolt hole and welded a little lip right there. And so the way this works is I put a piece of flat bar right here, and that creates a surface. Slide this over the top, and then you take one of your bolts, turn it upside down, and you slowly screw it down there by hand. And then, so this is where the board comes into play. So you want to lift this board up and just kind of put it under where those valves are going to sit. So that way the valves have nowhere to go when you tighten them down. Then what you're going to do is find the right socket and slowly start tightening it down on there. You want to do this by hand and not use an impact, because you could actually break it. And now the keepers are starting to become exposed. See the keepers right here. And what I'm going to do is take a magnet like this, and I'm going to pull those keepers out of there like that. Then once you have your keepers removed, then you want to back it off. Like I said, don't use an impact, because you don't want the spring flying off in your face, whether you have goggles on or not. If you guys want to see how to make that tool that I've built, let me know in the comments and I'll make a quick tip on how to weld up a valve spring removal tool. Another quick thing worth noting is sometimes when you remove the tension off these valve springs after you pulled the keepers off, is sometimes they don't just come off. So it's a good idea to kind of don't put your face over the top of it, put your hand over the top of it and just pick that keeper plate, and it'll just come right out like that. Now, what these are composed of is you've got two different types. So the first set have tops that are a little bit thicker. This one's thicker than this one. And the thicker ones are for the exhaust valves. The smaller ones are for the intake valves. And then they both have the same ring that the spring sits inside of. And then it's just a spring with another coiled spring on the inside of it. And those sit on top. So that's the order they go into. Now, depending on what you're doing, once you have everything out, just about everything you can throw into a single bag, and you can sort it out while you're cleaning it later, because all this stuff needs to be cleaned. So you want to take all the rockers, you want to replace the keepers, and it's good practice to replace the nuts too that go onto your rockers, because those get worn out. Now, as you heard me say, almost everything can go into a bag, with the exception of the actual valves. Now these need to go back into the place because these are worn in a certain way. And the quickest way that I've found to actually label these is by using one of these paint markers. You're going to clean them anyways, so you don't have to worry about having any paint inside your engine or anything like that. Or if you have a little woodworking skills, you can make yourself something like this where you've drilled holes in, and you can just set the valves right inside where they need to go. I've labeled this one driver's side and this one passenger, front and rear. And I've even cut in a little space back here for the keepers if I wanted to put them there. Next step I usually do is I start to vacuum, and I vacuum up everything just for a first round really quick to see kind of where things are, sort of as an assessment of the situation. After doing that, I noticed that there was still a little bit of gasket material left on here, so you can just, by hand, this one will just pop right up off of there, and we can toss that. The other thing that I noticed is that there is a huge amount of carbon built up right here, right next to this exhaust valve. So we're going to have to pick at that. So the next thing I usually do is I grab out my picks, flathead screwdriver and a hammer, and just kind of get at these areas that don't have anything to do with keeping a seal or anything like that. This doesn't need to be sealed in. This is all open inside of the intake, so it's not that big of a deal. So I got a fair amount out. So what I'm going to do now is vacuum it up. There's a couple other spots here that I can get some of this heavier deposits of even old oil you can scrape away. Want to get everything kind of lumpy. And then, so here's another thing too. So right here, you see how the casting is really kind of closed off right there. What these do is, so when the oil is pumped up through the engine, it runs down and back through these to be filtered again. So if you take your flathead screwdriver on these lips that aren't quite, nice with the castings, see the other ones go all the way down. You just want everything to look uniform. So if you take this flathead screwdriver like this, you take your hammer on top of it, just break off just like that. And then you've got a little more room in there for that oil to run down. And it's just sort of an error, as you see when they were casting it. This one here too is the same thing, along with this one here and the rest of them. So I'm going to clean those up and I'll be right back. Another place to look on these Chevy heads to see if the casting is messed up is these holes here. And they're over on this side and also on this side as well, right down here. And they usually did pretty well back in the 70s and the 80s when they cast these, but these ones I've cleaned up now, and it doesn't need anything special. I'm not going for a high flow engine or anything wild with this one. It's just a basic rebuild. The next thing you want to do is you want to vacuum again. So if you're starting to see a pattern, then I think you're paying attention. So when I get to this point, then I'll start to really kind of heavily focus on the gasket areas. I've cleaned off, all the major carbon and, oil reserves and stuff like that has been left behind. So we'll focus on something a little bit smaller. I always go smallest to biggest. So first things first, I'll kind of take a razor blade, and these are really nice tools to have. Really inexpensive. You can get them at any car parts store, mostly any auto parts store. They'll sell these little scrapers, and you can buy the razor blades for dollars, pretty cheap. So what I'll start to do is I'll start to kind of run this over, at a pretty flat angle with the gasket surface, and just kind of scrape around and, you know, not put any marks into it, but just get anything off the top layer that might still be there, you know, old gasket material. Not trying to dig into the surface, you're just trying to lightly glide across it, you know, with minimal pressure. About as much pressure as you would use to write with a pen. And then the next surface that I'll get to is this one here. See how somebody's been under this cover. I don't think they've been inside the engine, but somebody's been messing underneath the valve cover, probably some adjustment or something at some point. That's what all this orange mess is. Following my methods, then this will be just fine. We can get the rest of this off with the wire wheels. But if you're actually using just a razor blade, you might want to keep at it for a little while longer if you're wanting to get the results that we're putting in. And now we're back to this surface here, so just do the same thing. Just go along the edges and, you know, like I said, just as much pressure as you would put on a pen to write. Kind of hard. And just go around and, you know, slowly keep it at a pretty flat angle. You know, probably a 10-degree off the surface. You know, really pretty level. And you just want to go around, and this part's going to give you a lot of trouble because there's a lot of carbon that comes out of this exhaust port. So you just kind of go around it. We're going to get to it. You know, just get everything you can. It doesn't have to be perfect. Once you get to this point, you want to go back to your flathead. Now it's going to be kind of hard to get this stuff out of here. So what you're going to want to do is line it up as close as you can with the edge, and then just kind of chisel it out of there, and you'll start to get it little by little. It'll start to kind of come off in chunks. As you can see, just by chiseling away at it for a few minutes, I got most of it out of there. This next part is where you're going to see most of your results actually starting to come to life. Once again, what you're going to use is the cup tool on your drill of choice. And like I said, since this is brass, you don't have to worry about it scratching down into the surface really deep of the cast iron. Now if you have aluminum heads, you want to be a little bit more careful. But since we're just using the cast iron heads, you're totally fine to use this. You don't got to worry about any kind of compression loss or anything like that. And remember that leftover gasket material that we had here that I said we'd take care of later? This is a great thing to use on that too, because it'll just kick it right off of there, as well as shine this up really nice. As you can see, I was able to get most of this off with using just the cup tool. That's when this tool here comes in handy. It makes it so you're able to get into the tight, hard to reach places. Now that surface looks a lot better. Moving on to the next one. So you're going to take your drill with the cup bit and you're going to start to work the surfaces. As I stated before, make sure that you're wearing safety glasses while you do this. So once you've ran the drill till it's pretty much all metal colored and you've gotten the majority of stuff off, you'll start to notice that there are a couple of little pieces like this, and it's just gasket material. So once you get to that point, then you can just take your scraper and just kind of scrape it down some, and then you're just going to go back over it. And then you're just going to run your drill over it. Okay, so now we're going to do this surface here, and the way we're going to do that is we're going to use the cup tool. The reason why we don't do the combustion chamber side first, second, third, and we do it fourth is because that's the side that we usually have down when we're working on the heads on a bench. It just makes it a lot easier. Instead of having to have it up on its side and trying to screw stuff down here, we've got it flat on the ground. So we want to do that last, so that way it's the cleanest, so that way our work surface is clean when we're done with that final piece. And the best way to do this is just to kind of go around in sections. So you're going to want to go over all the valve seats and just go to the next, the next, the next, and then just kind of go around the best you can with this cup tool and just get this whole area cleaned out. It doesn't matter if you scratch it or anything like that. You just don't want to scratch down inside of the valve guides. So I start by going over the valve springs and then just around from there. And usually the only thing in here is oil grime and stuff of that nature. Just oil comes through here usually, unless you have a cracked head, in which water would come through here. But this engine didn't have a cracked head. Just after going over those valve spring seats, and they just look great already. Back to the wheel tool to kind of get into those hard to reach areas. If you can't get into those hard to reach places and it's just really not good enough for you, then you can spark up your OCD and pick up your Dremel with a little cutting tool. You can go in here and kind of get the rest of those little oil deposits out. Now that we got our OCD out of the way, let's work on the sides. Not really that bad, so all we really got to do is just give them a nice brush on the tops. On the other side. Now if there are hard deposits on the side, just dirt or whatever, you want to get those off before we use the mineral spirits and the paint. After you're done with that, I always consider this a good time to stop, remove the head, and clean off your work surface because you're going to be cleaning the last surface. Okay, so the first thing we want to do, like we did in the very beginning, is we want to look and see what we have here. Make sure all of our valve seats are still nicely cut and that there's nothing really too major wrong with them. Then the next thing we want to do is we want to clean out these valleys, the intake valleys. And the way that we're going to do that is with the cup tool, and then we'll go back to the disc tool. What we're going to get to is the cylinder head itself. So I'm not going to go down into the combustion chambers just yet, but I am going to do the cylinder head mating surface here with the cup brush. Thing I'm going to do is take the time to spray out all the passages to make sure that I didn't get any tiny pieces of brass or anything like that down inside the cylinder head. Let's take a look at what we got from the work that we did today. We got nice surfaces. They look really clean compared to what we started with. We've got a clean surface, almost ready for paint. So the final step of preparation is to get this. So the first step of paint preparation is to get some mineral spirits or some kind of cleaning agent to wipe down the block with. So what you do is you just kind of get some on there. You want to wipe down all the surfaces that are going to be painted and all the surfaces that you're going to tape, so that the tape and the paint have a clean surface to adhere to. Once you've completely cleaned the cylinder head, what I do is I take 2 paper towels and I fold them in half. And I put the line pretty close to the front. Then I take my masking tape and I get a line just about the right length. Take it, and then you want to just set that right on top of that, where that exhaust gasket's going to sit. So that way it's all covered up. Then you want to fold in the side. Right here. And it's okay if you go over. You can always cut that off. Can't go under, you can go over. And go to the other side, fold it in, and do the exact same thing. And I also made a video on this next little trick that I'm going to show you. So you're going to put these over here, and I'll link that in the description if you want to learn how I do this little trick to get these pieces of tape on here cut just perfectly. So look for that in the description. Just like that. And what I like to do is take some paper towel and jam it down into the spark plug holes. That way your threads don't get any paint on them. You just stuff it down there as tight as it'll go. It's usually good practice to plug up any other holes. Like this is a water hole here for a temperature sensor. And so you just take some paper towel and wad it up. Put it in there and then cut off this bit here and Usually I'll throw a little bit of tape around this so it kind of stays out of the way when I'm painting. So grab a piece of tape and wrap that up. Then you can kind of twist it in there a little further so that way it's a flush seal like that. And then flip it over, and the last area that you actually have to cover, let's flip it this way. Because the last area that you're going to have to cover is going to be the first area that we started cleaning. So you just want to tape this whole area up. So I'm going to start doing that. And I don't like to paint inside, so I come out here in the yard and just kind of set it on an old chair that The trick to painting is less is best, so you actually do want to keep it about 12 inches away. And you don't want to stop spraying on whatever you're painting. So you want to wait till you get to the end of it and then stop once you're completely off of it. And that will reduce your runs. And I usually do about 2 coats of paint when I do these engine heads. Just let that set. We'll be back in a minute. So this head sat for about 10 to 15 minutes, so I'm going to give it one more little coat, just covering all the dark spots. Okay, and that's all done. So now at this point what we can do is, if you're impatient like me, start pulling the paint off to see what you ended up with in the end. And that'll do just nice for this engine that this is going to go on. That'll be just perfect. There you have it, a fresh set of clean heads that are newly painted. If you like what you saw in this video, make sure you like and subscribe so that way you can keep up to date with all my content.